Pentagon Press Secretary Patrick Ryder told reporters that no type of weapon will become a game changer, allowing the Kyiv government to emerge victorious in the current conflict. US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and the Pentagon have in fact acknowledged now that there is no one capability, there is no silver bullet that is going to enable Ukraine to succeed. Is this one of the reasons for the delay in providing permission to Ukraine for use of long-range weapons? I'm being joined by Dr. DIESEN to discuss this further right here on Game Plan. Dr. DIESEN is a professor of international relations at the University of Southeastern Norway and an editor at the Russia in Global Affairs journal. Dr. DIESEN, always a pleasure speaking with you. Why is US reluctant to provide more long-range weapons to Ukraine or hesitant in loosening restrictions on Ukraine? Because they still haven't given a go-ahead. There's no nod on it yet.
Well, I think that's the correct question, Shivan, because with all new escalations, there will always be a cost and a benefit of supplying weapons. So the argument effectively coming from the Americans is that this new escalation will have insufficient impact. But I think they also recognize it will be an immense escalation as these weapons will rely on US satellites and likely US operators as well. So this will be a huge shift in the war, effectively a US direct attack on Russia, which is why it could lead to a direct war. And I think that is good to acknowledge also there won't be any silver bullets here. And one has to point out that there's a very long history of countries searching for wonder weapons, the Wunderwaffe, to turn the tide of the war, especially towards the end of a war. This is a very common phenomenon, simply because there's a combination of desperation, denial. There's also this psychological hope to keep morale up by introducing something completely new. And we've seen this in the Ukraine war as well, with every weapon sent, like the Javelins, Leopards, Abrahams, the HIMARS, of course, F-16s. All of these were supposed to be these huge game changers, which are selling not just to our own public, but also to the Ukrainians to boost morale and hoping that things will turn around. But at the end, we just end up escalating. But as I mentioned before, I think these long-range precision missiles, as they can only work through US satellites and operated with US soldiers, this is something completely different, which can be seen as a direct US attack on Russia. So given that the costs are so high and the benefits may be limited, also due to the limitations of these missiles, it's probably one step too far on the escalation ladder, which is why it's hopefully the Americans will reconsider this.
Dr. DIESEN, now Mr. Putin's remarks, and I'm just going to quote here because this was the translation of what he said: "We will make appropriate decisions based on the threats that will be created for us." This is, of course, if Ukraine gets permission to use those long-range weapons to target inside Russia. What kind of retaliation can one expect from Russia if Ukraine gets permission to strike inside Russian territory?
Well, you both have horizontal escalation as well as vertical escalation or retaliation. Now, the horizontal one tends to look at how they can escalate in other fields of conflict. So, for example, sending air defenses to Iran, sending Russian warships to the Caribbean, doing these arms deals with North Korea, or simply sending weapons to US adversaries and NATO adversaries, as the Russians have said before. They could also possibly assist in striking with maybe intelligence for anyone who wants to strike US occupation troops in Syria or Iraq. So there's many possibilities on the horizontal scope. This is often preferential because it doesn't trigger necessarily a World War III, but it's also a message which doesn't seem to have arrived properly in Washington. Now, the vertical escalation would suggest a more direct attack on NATO targets. Here, of course, the problem is it could trigger World War III. And this might be more likely an escalation the Russians might pursue now, because, again, these new weapons which the Americans are sending, long-range precision missiles, which will be operated by the Americans, this is, again, a direct attack on Russia. So I think a vertical escalation from Russia might be more likely this time around, which is why I'm warning against this dangerous delusion that it's simply helping Ukraine, that we're not NATO, that is not directly involved. But there's a big problem in the West. We can't really admit that this is NATO is involved in this war, that is attacking Russia, because then you can be seen as taking the side of Russia. So we're going into this dangerous delusion where we're effectively now attacking Russia directly and pretending as if we're not involved. So it's a very dangerous and we should take Putin's warnings very seriously.
It can't just be considered plain rhetoric. And I've spoken with other voices from the Western side as well, and there is a general consensus that this time the warnings seem to be far more grave. They seem to be far more serious in tone. That is as much as most voices have admitted. But clearly, if you just go by the word meanings of it, it is serious this time. That it is going to be a direct NATO-Russia war, and I feel neither side really wants to have that as the final conclusion to this ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. At this point, Dr. DIESEN, it is assumed that permissions will be granted to Ukraine with restrictions. But there's no guarantee that Ukraine is going to abide by the rules, given the nature of the war and that Russia has already warned of its response. If Ukraine gets that permission, who's to say that they are going to abide by the restrictions that are imposed on them? Is this only going to raise tensions further for the West?
Yes, but let me just first, I agree. But the key problem is that we in NATO, they tend to interpret all Russian restraints in terms of reacting or retaliating as weakness, something that proves there's no red lines, which we can do whatever we want. And this is what we're writing in our media, that Russia is bluffing. They won't do anything because they're too afraid of NATO, so we can effectively bomb Moscow as it is. Now, in terms of the rules and restrictions, I think, well, over the past 2 weeks, we've seen civilian apartment buildings in Moscow which has been struck, even the Domodedovo International Airport in Moscow. We see NATO weapons being used, even cluster ammunition against civilian targets in the Russian city of Belgorod, and also NATO weapons being used in the invasion of Russian territory in Kursk. So one has to ask where the rules are. My main question is, are these then rules, are they temporary, and is this enough? Because Ukraine, they could even have an interest in striking civilian targets with these weapons, as it would signal to the West again that there are no red lines to be respected. And this could also be a way of provoking a Russian response that pulls the US into the war, which is also something Ukraine needs in order to get out of this mess, because it's in a very difficult spot now. But my main point again is this: whether or not these rules matter, if they're temporary or not, because NATO has a very common practice. This applies to the expansion, the missile defense, Ukraine war, and other conflicts. And this is of incrementalism or salami tactics. You gradually introduce new weapons, then with rules, so restrictions, so there won't be too fierce response, but then you gradually remove the rules. So what I would expect is this long-range weapons being supplied with restrictions, and if there's not a proper response from the Russians in terms of retaliation, then the US will gradually remove the restrictions. So the purpose of such salami tactics is to escalate without triggering opposition from your own public, from allies, also the adversary. And if the adversary responds, then you can say, well, it's unprovoked, it's excessive, given that this was only a small escalation. And this has been the NATO trademark over the past 30 years, actually. And this is also why the British are first supplying these Storm Shadows, because they're effectively kicking in the door of the new red lines. If there's no Russian response, then the Americans will follow through that door. And this is the path we tend to take in with NATO's escalations against Ukraine over the past 10 years.
Absolutely. I just want to point out for our viewers that I had this discussion with Dr. DIESEN about a month ago. This is a few days after the Kursk invasion, and Dr. DIESEN had pointed out that this is going to be a game of who blinks first. Will Russia move its troops from inching towards Pokrovsk and direct them back towards Kursk, or will Russia continue over there as Ukraine maintains its ground in Kursk? And Russia has done just that. They've actually inched further and further and further towards Kursk and towards Pokrovsk, and of course that is going to be a major loss for Ukraine if Russia gains control of that logistical hub, exactly how you had pointed out to us and our viewers on Game Plan about a month ago. It's always a pleasure speaking with you, Glenn. That was Dr. Glenn DIESEN, Professor of International Relations at the University of Southeastern Norway and editor at the Russia in Global Affairs Journal. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Thank you, Shivan.